I think we're ready to start if we want to start the webinar. Hi, everyone. My name is Brendan Stone. I'm the co-chair of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War and one of your co-hosts today for this exciting event. And I heard over 150 people have registered for it. So I'm really glad that there's this kind of interest in today's event. So thanks for joining us. And once we get the chat started in a few minutes, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We don't want to have too many distractions, so we'll get the chat going once the introductions are over. Today's event features 3 speakers who should give a lot of food for discussion, and I'm not going to take away time from them. You'll be hearing from them and seeing them very shortly. We're going to utilize the built-in Zoom question and answer box in order to forward questions to our discussants for the question and answer period, which will open up soon. But before that happens, we're also going to hear from Janine, and she's going to talk about how today's events correspond to an upcoming series, a Days of Action against war in Ukraine that's going to be happening from October 1st to October 8th. And then I'm going to explain some aspects of how Zoom is going to work today in terms of the chat and the closed captioning and such. But I think what we should do right now is let's go over to Janine. She's going to tell you more about the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network and the campaigns that are running now, especially the upcoming Days of Action. So let's go over to Janine.
Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, from wherever you are. My name is Janine Solanki, and I'm representing Mobilization Against War and Occupation, MAWO, in Vancouver on the unceded and traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam peoples. And I know many of us here are joining from many different parts of the world, or especially parts of Canada. So I think we all can take a moment to recognize the land that we are all joining in from the Indigenous land, and the importance of standing for self-determination for Indigenous nations. So as I was asked to speak about, the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network is made up of over 45 organizations, and we're coming together as anti-war, peace, environmental, international solidarity, and social justice organizations from across Canada. We came together in 2020, but really, I think during the pandemic, we're able to fill the space of organizing when we could not safely come out onto the streets, and able to organize things like webinars, able to communicate more across Canada, and build more important campaigns. And as we've been coming out onto the street more in the last couple of years, we've been able to organize many cross-Canada united and coordinated actions, release statements as a network together, and share tools and knowledge among anti-war and peace and social justice groups across the network. So it's definitely a great thing that the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network is able to organize the anti-war movement more effectively and more united across Canada. And that's why we're coming together for this webinar today, for one of our very important campaigns against NATO and for Canada out of NATO. Some of the other work that the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network does has been especially protesting and calling for an end to the US-backed, Canada-armed, Saudi-led war on Yemen, and in particular calling for Canada to stop arming Saudi Arabia. We have had many days of action around that important campaign and statements, and I encourage people to check out our website to learn more. And also, if you're an organization that might want to join the network, we also encourage you to do that. Right now, this webinar today is leading up to an important global week of action to end the war on Ukraine. Actions will be taking place in Europe, in the United States, around the world really, and across Canada, coordinated by the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. So in a moment, I'll post in the chat the link to more information about this global week of action. But so far we have 7 cities, Toronto, Vancouver, Winnipeg, Montreal, Hamilton, Waterloo, and Victoria, and I believe we'll have Regina also. So 8 cities. And of course, there are more to come. And if you are wanting to organize something in your city, please let us know. We are really wanting to focus with these important days of action on the demands of stop the war, stop NATO, and also other important demands such as fund peace, not war, and also against the fighter jets, which Canada is spending $88 billion on these horribly destructive weapons of death that we are wholly opposed to, when this money should be spent on things like climate justice and other important things against that are helping people here in Canada. So we encourage people to get involved. I'll post more information in the chat, and come join us for the Global Week of Action, October 1st to 8th. So I'll hand it back over to Brendan to go over a few logistics.
Thanks, Janine. That was very helpful. I hope to see people October 1st to 8th. I know there will be events here in the Greater Toronto Area, GTA Hamilton region. So thanks for pointing that out. And I hope people do follow up on the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network and its initiatives in that regard. I see the chat's been open. So I see people are posting in where they come from and such. That's great. We love to see that. So feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and point out what city or organization you're from. The chat will be kept open for most of the event. We do encourage respectful discussion. We don't want to see any form of discrimination in the chat or any trolling or disruption. So if people are engaging in that kind of activity, they will receive warnings. And if they keep doing it, they will be asked to leave. But I know people are excited about the chat and it's already going. As far as questions go, questions for our distinguished guest today can be put in the question and answer box. I'm just looking at Zoom here. At the bottom or wherever your menu is, there's an icon or a box called Q&A, question and answer. And that's where you would put your questions in. We have a dedicated box for that. And you can type out your question. I don't think other people will be able to see it, but we can. And what's going to happen is we're going to read out your question to the panelist you address that question to. So that'll happen later on after the panelists give their initial speeches. So please use the question and answer box. We might take a few questions from the chat, but it's easier for us to use the Q&A box. Also, closed captioning is available for this event. So if you have difficulty, audio difficulty, then of course this chat and everything we're saying is being automatically transcribed by a computer into subtitled text. So you can access that text. There's a button that says CC for closed captioning, and just click on that and it will show the closed captioning. So if you need those accessibility options, they are available for you. Yes, so that's basically how it's going to work today. And I know people want to get to our speakers. We have Dimitri, Mary, and Glenn all waiting to go. So I think what I'm going to do is I'll introduce our first speaker, Dimitri Lascaris. It's my great pleasure to do so, and it hasn't been long since I did that last. Of course, we toured Dimitri Lascaris around all summer for his big campaign, which many people are well aware of, and you can read about it on his website at dimitrilaskaris.ca, or he'll tell you what his website is. So I highly encourage you to follow up on that. I mean, he's someone who hardly needs an introduction, but Dimitri Laskaris is a lawyer, journalist, and activist. After graduating from the U of T Faculty of Law in 1991, he began his legal career at Sullivan and Cromwell. And in 2012, he was named by Canadian Lawyer magazine as one of the 25 most influential in Canada, and also by the Canadian Business magazine as one of the 50 most influential persons in Canadian business. So he's been a correspondent and board member of the Real News Network and served on the boards of numerous other public interest not-for-profit corporations, including the Unity Project for the Relief of Homelessness. And in 2020, as you may know, as people here especially may know, Dimitri announced his candidacy for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. And that contest concluded in October of 2020. Dimitri finished in second place out of 8 candidates, garnering 45.5% of the votes on the 8th and final ballot. So welcome, Dimitri. I'm sure you have a lot to say, so let's get to it.
Can you hear me now? All fine? Did you hear what I was just saying? Because I saw an unmute button pop up on the screen.
No, we didn't hear you before what you just said.
Okay. All right. I was just, thanking Brendan for the kind introduction and saying a big thank you to all of the organizers, our comrades at the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, who did such an outstanding job on that speaking tour, from which I'm still recovering, by the way, but it was a good experience all the same, and one that I learned a great deal from myself. And tonight I'm coming to you from Kalamata in the south of Greece. It's 1:15 in the morning here, but I've had a nice strong cup of coffee, so hopefully I'll be alert and able to answer all of your questions when we get to the Q&A. I'd like to begin, as you may know, I've been asked to address specifically the question of cluster munitions and their use in the war in Ukraine. But before I say that, before I address that specific issue, I want to say that this event is being held, in my opinion, at an extraordinarily important moment in this existentially dangerous war. My sense of what is happening on the battlefield, politically, geopolitically, is that this war is at an inflection point. The West is now confronted by a series of options, none of which is particularly desirable. One is to wind down its support for Ukraine and pressure the Ukrainian government to enter into meaningful negotiations with the Russian Federation. The other is to escalate. And the third is to simply plod along. And in circumstances where the narrative has begun to break down, the misleading narrative about this war that we've been peddled from the very outset, and in circumstances, frankly, where the public's appetite for continuing to expend large sums of money and take the risks that are attendant upon this war is greatly diminished, and is diminishing by the day, in my opinion. So this is a moment when it is particularly important, I think, for every conscientious citizen to do what they can to persuade our governments to pursue the path of peace, rather than to pursue the path of kicking the can down the road, which would have potentially catastrophic consequences for all of us, but certainly catastrophic consequences for Ukraine, or even worse, escalating. And as many of you will know, President Volodymyr Zelensky will be coming to Canada, I understand, later this week. I understand he's going to be speaking to the Parliament tomorrow, and we'll be having meetings in Toronto. So if you have the opportunity to reach out to your member of Parliament, or anybody who may have some role to play in deciding Canadian government policy towards this war going forward, I would strongly urge you to do that. And I hope that that's a subject we'll be able to explore in greater length in the Q&A. So with that, I'd like to turn to the specific subject of cluster munitions. And I'll start by talking a little bit about the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which was adopted in Dublin, Ireland in May of 2008. Today, there are 112 state parties to the convention, and 124 states have committed to its goals. So most states in the world are parties to the convention. The state parties include Canada, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Spain, and Italy. The only members of NATO that are not state parties to the convention are the United States, Poland, Greece, Cyprus, Turkey, Romania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland. So basically the United States and a smattering of states in Eastern Europe. In addition, Ukraine, Russia, and China are not state parties to the convention. In a nutshell, the Convention on Cluster Munitions prohibits all use, stockpiling, production, and transfer of cluster munitions. Separate articles in the convention concern destruction of stockpiles, clearance of contaminated areas, assistance to victims, submission of transparency reports, and adoption of domestic legislation. And I want to read to you a portion of the preamble to the convention, which I think will hopefully convey a sense of the importance of this subject to international peace and security. It starts with these words: the state parties to this convention, deeply concerned that civilian populations and individual civilians continue to bear the brunt of armed conflict, determined to put an end for all time to the suffering and casualties caused by cluster munitions at the time of their use, when they fail to function as intended, or when they are abandoned, concerned that cluster munition remnants kill or maim civilians, including women and children, obstruct economic and social development, including through the loss of livelihood, impede post-conflict rehabilitation and reconstruction, delay or prevent the return of refugees and internally displaced persons, can negatively impact on national, international peace building and humanitarian assistance efforts, and have other severe consequences that can persist for many years after use. And deeply concerned also at the dangers presented by the large national stockpiles of cluster munitions retained for operational use, and determined to ensure their rapid destruction. So why have so many states acceded to this convention? What makes cluster munitions so dangerous that a majority of states have committed not to use them under any circumstances? In a July 2020 statement by the Human Rights Watch Advocacy Director, Mary Wareham, Ms. Wareham wrote, cluster munitions are prohibited for two main reasons. First, they spread multiple bomblets or submunitions indiscriminately over a wide area, which can be devastating for civilians caught in a strike. Second, many submunitions fail to explode on initial impact, leaving dangerous duds that, like landmines, can kill and maim for years to come unless cleared and destroyed. Historically, the vast majority of the victims of cluster munitions have been civilians. In 2020, for example, the Cluster Munition Monitor, which I believe grew out of the Convention on Cluster Munitions, reported in its annual report that globally 360 new cluster munition casualties were recorded in 2020, killing 107 people and leaving 242 injured. This marks a continuing increase from the updated annual totals of 317 casualties in 2019 and 277 in 2018. And critically, these words, civilians accounted for all casualties whose status was recorded in 2020. This is consistent with statistics on cluster munition casualties for all time due to the indiscriminate and inhumane nature of these weapons. Now, as was widely publicized in July of this year, the Biden administration announced that it was providing cluster munitions to Ukraine's military, and that it was doing so because the US military was running short of non-cluster artillery shells due to the extraordinarily high rate of their consumption in the Ukraine war. When that announcement was made, Ukraine was entering the second month of its highly anticipated counteroffensive that began on June 4th. So this announcement about the cluster munitions being provided to Ukraine was more than a month after that. And according to Biden, Ukraine needed the cluster munitions to achieve the goals of that counteroffensive. In an interview with CNN's Fareed Zakaria, Biden stated, "But the main thing is they either have the weapons to stop the Russians now from their keep them from stopping the Ukrainian offensive through these areas, or they don't. And I think they needed them. So Biden tied them to the necessity of success in the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And this was a position that was echoed by various members of Congress, including Democratic Senator Chris Coons, who, in the course of trying to defend Biden's indefensible decision, said this was a very hard decision. The president really, he listened to all sides. And then he said the Ukrainians are at risk of losing this counteroffensive if they run out of their shells. It is now widely acknowledged, however, we are now into the 4th month of this counteroffensive, and the autumn rains will be beginning shortly, which is widely acknowledged to be a major impediment to the movement of armored vehicles, that this counteroffensive has failed, notwithstanding the provision of cluster munitions, notwithstanding their extensive use on the battlefield. Ukraine has not achieved and will not achieve its objective in this counteroffensive, and that objective was to sever Russia's land bridge to Crimea by seizing the Russian-controlled city of Melitopol, which is just north of the Sea of Azov. What has happened during these 4 months, and you can confirm this for yourselves by going to the Pro-Ukraine Institute of the Study of War website, which is based in Washington and was founded by some leading neocons in the United States. They have a map which shows the territory that's been captured by Ukraine during these 4 months of horrific, bloody warfare, and it is truly negligible. They're nowhere close to taking the city of Melitopol. Ukrainian forces haven't even pierced the second of 3 lines of defense, and there's some dispute about whether they even managed to pierce the first line of defense. And they've lost, according to Western sources, enormous numbers of soldiers. The estimates range from 40 to 70,000 dead and wounded, a staggering figure for 3.5 months of counteroffensive. So grim is the situation that Professor John Mearsheimer, he's known as a leading political scientist of the realist school, but he's also a former US Air Force officer and a graduate of West Point. In a detailed analysis of the counteroffensive, which he published on his Substack a few days ago, he termed it a colossal failure. And it's been an enormous tragedy for the Ukrainian people. But the point here I really want to stress is the pretext for the provision of these extraordinarily harmful and dangerous weapons, these cluster munitions, to the Ukrainian military turned out to be a pipe dream. Now, there's simply no question that these munitions have not turned the tide in the favor of the Ukrainian military. Now, prior to Biden's announcement in July of this year that his administration would provide cluster munitions to Ukraine, Russia's military faced numerous accusations from Western sources that it had used cluster munitions extensively in Ukraine. And there are credible allegations to that effect. And this is something that has been commented upon by the United States government. And in fact, in a press briefing given on February 28th, 2022, which was several days after the invasion began, Biden's former press secretary, Jen Psaki, was asked about reports that Russia had used cluster munitions. The question was, if it's true, what is the next step of this administration? And is there a red line for how much violence will be tolerated against civilians in this manner that's illegal and potentially a war crime? And Ms. Psaki responded, it would be. I don't have any confirmation of that. And here she's referring to reports that cluster munitions were used by the Russian forces. And she goes on and she says, but we have seen the reports. If that were true, it would potentially be a war crime. So Ms. Psaki herself, only months before these munitions were provided by the Biden administration to Ukraine for use in this war, qualified this as potentially as a war crime. At the time that Biden announced the provision of cluster munitions to Ukraine, Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, denied that Russia had used cluster munitions in Ukraine. But he did say that if such munitions were used against Russian forces, Russia reserved the right to employ them as well. One of the human rights groups that has accused Russia of using cluster munitions in Ukraine is the US-based Human Rights Watch. HRW's allegations against Russia have been widely publicized. What has not been widely publicized in the West is that HRW also accused Ukraine of using cluster munitions and of using those munitions well before President Biden announced that the US would provide them in July of this year to the Ukrainian military. Specifically, on July 6th of this year, and at this point in time, the Biden administration was openly musing about providing cluster munitions to Ukraine, but had not committed yet to doing so. HRW revealed the results of some new research it had performed. And that research, according to Human Rights Watch, was that Ukrainian cluster munition rocket attacks on Russian-controlled areas in and around the city of Izium in eastern Ukraine during 2022, that was last year, caused many casualties among Ukrainian civilians. Ukrainian cluster munition rocket attacks in the city of Izium in 2022 killed at least 8 civilians and wounded 15 more. The attacks occurred in Izium and surrounding areas where Russian forces had arrived in March, seized control by early April, and remained in control until early September. The total number of civilians, I'm quoting here from Human Rights Watch, killed and wounded in the cluster munition attacks that Human Rights Watch examined is most likely greater. Russian forces took many injured civilians to Russia for medical care, and many had not returned when Human Rights Watch visited. An ambulance driver said he and his colleagues had regularly transported and treated civilians, including children, with cluster munition injuries during the Russian occupation. He estimated that he took at least one such case to the hospital every day. A man from the village of Helinsky said that in May 2022, he heard a cluster munition rocket strike near his home. Suddenly, he said, I heard my father screaming, I've been hit, I can't move. He ran back and saw that his father had fallen on his knees, but couldn't move from the waist down, and that there were many metal pieces in him, including one sticking out of his spine and another in his chest. The man's father received medical treatment, but died a month later after undergoing surgery. This victim died from what Human Rights Watch says was a Ukrainian cluster munition attack taking place months before the Biden administration agreed to provide these weapons to Ukraine. Now, it's not only Human Rights Watch that accused the Ukrainian forces of using cluster munitions in 2022. So too did the United Nations in a report in which it found that Ukrainian armed forces used cluster munitions in attacks on that same city, Izium, between March and September of 2022. That would mean that Ukraine began using them almost immediately following the commencement of the invasion in February of 2022. And it gets worse. All the way back in 2014, the New York Times, hardly a pro-Russian media outlet, reported that Ukrainian forces used cluster munitions against its own citizens 8 years before the Russian invasion. And I'm quoting from the New York Times report, the Ukrainian army appears to have fired cluster munitions on several occasions into the heart of Donetsk, unleashing a weapon banned in much of the world into a rebel-held city with a peacetime population of more than 1 million, according to physical evidence and interviews with witnesses and victims. Why do I point all of this out? Because it shows that beyond a shadow of a doubt, when the Biden administration decided to provide cluster munitions to Ukraine in July of this year, it was aware of detailed reports and allegations by Human Rights Watch, the United Nations, and the New York Times on Ukraine's use of cluster munitions in civilian areas with lethal impacts on Ukrainian civilians. Despite its awareness of these credible reports, that same administration whose spokesperson only months earlier had qualified their use as a potential war crime decided to give cluster munitions to the Ukrainian military anyways. This brings me to the question of Canada's role in all of this. As I mentioned, Canada is a state party to the Convention on Cluster Munitions. It is important to understand that that convention does not only prohibit state parties from using cluster munitions themselves, it also obliges them not to facilitate their use by others. Article 1 of the convention states, each party undertakes never under any circumstances to A, use cluster munitions, B, develop, produce, otherwise acquire, stockpile, retain, or transfer to anyone directly or indirectly cluster munitions, and C, assist, encourage, or induce anyone to engage in any activity prohibited to a state party under this convention. When Biden announced that his administration would provide cluster munitions to Ukraine, our prime minister stated that cluster munitions, quote, should never be used. In all likelihood, therefore, Canada's government takes or would take the position that Canada has not violated Article 1C of the Convention on Cluster Munitions because rather than encourage their use in Ukraine, Canada's Prime Minister expressly discouraged their use under any circumstances. That argument, however, would ignore the critical difference between words and actions. Although Trudeau's rhetoric expressed opposition to the use of cluster munitions in Ukraine, his government has continued to provide every imaginable form of support, military, economic, and political, to Ukraine and its armed forces, and has done so despite knowing, as it undoubtedly does, that Ukraine used cluster munitions, including in civilian areas, all the way back to 2014, and prior to the provision of these munitions to Ukraine by the Biden administration this year. Just a few days ago, Canada announced that it would spend $33 million more on top of the $8 billion it has already spent on purchasing air defense systems for Ukraine. And I ask as a lawyer, what kind of a message in Canada is Canada sending to Ukraine by continuing to arm the military there while knowing full well that Ukraine has used cluster munitions in civilian areas with deadly consequences for civilians? I would argue that this amounts to tacit encouragement to use cluster munitions, whatever rhetoric Canada's government may employ. Its actions, in fact, communicate unequivocally that it will impose no meaningful consequences on its ally for using these munitions and will continue to support that ally in every conceivable way, even if it is killing civilians with cluster munitions. And I would submit to you that that is tacit encouragement. It is axiomatic, my friends, that actions speak louder than words, and Canada's actions evince absolutely no disapproval of the use of these munitions on civilians. In my opinion, therefore, Canada is violating at least the spirit, if not the letter, of Article 1 of the Convention. And the final argument I briefly want to address, because I've heard it from people who've tried to defend the Biden administration's decision, is that because Russia is using cluster munitions, it's permissible for the US to provide them to Ukraine and for Ukraine to employ them. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Russia has in fact used them. And let's assume that Russia has used them in civilian areas. This argument is nonetheless completely devoid of merit. It flies in the face of all that we are told about the West. Our countries, our governments are supposedly morally superior to the so-called authoritarian governments of this world. We are told constantly that we set the standards by which civilized, democratic, and humane nations conduct themselves. And I think that all persons of conscience would agree that if our enemies engage in torture, that does not make it permissible for us to engage in torture. If our enemies commit ethnic cleansing, it is not permissible for us to do so. If our enemies commit acts of genocide, it is not permissible for us to commit acts of genocide. And the same reasoning applies to the use of these munitions. Even if Russia has used them, even if it's used them in civilian areas, no person of conscience would say that that entitles us and our allies to employ these deadly and inexcusable weapons. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dimitri. That was very powerful, and it gives us a lot to think about. I'm sure there's going to be questions. In fact, I'm seeing questions in the chat. I'd encourage people to utilize the Q&A, the question and answer function that's built into Zoom for this webinar. That's mainly how we will be handling questions in this webinar. So you can type a question in the Q&A box and it will be read to the panelist whom you address it to. Nice to see people engaging respectfully in the chat and people continue to post interesting items. So good to see that ongoing. And thank you again, Dimitri. I know it's a ridiculous hour where you are right now. It must be 1 a.m. or something. So thanks again for doing this. But I think let's, I guess what's going to happen is we'll move on to Janine. She's going to introduce our next panelist.
Great, thank you. I'm very happy to invite up Mary Ann Grady Flores to the virtual mic. Mary Ann is a longtime peace activist from upstate New York who testified 7 times at the United Nations Commission on Decolonization about the testing of depleted uranium weapons on by US armed forces in Puerto Rico. Mary Ann has faced arrest and jail time for participating in protests, also against military drones, and even just for photographing a protest of an airfield where drone pilots were being trained and where missions are carried out. So Mary Ann has done really amazing and important work in the anti-war movement, and also as a member of the Upstate New York Coalition to Ground the Drones and End the Wars. So I'll pass it over to Mary Ann. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to hearing your talk and presentation. We'll bring up slides in just a moment.
Okay, Janine, thank you. And Dimitri, I am so honored to be on this panel with you and also with Glenn. So greetings, I'm Mary Ann Grady Flores here on Cayuga People's Land, a part of the Haudenosaunee Nation's territory, which is also known as upstate New York. I'm a part of the Ithaca Catholic Workers, and I'm also, besides doing the anti-drone work to end the assassinations by drones and being a part of Ban Killer Drones, we have another effort called the Merchants of Death Tribunal. Dimitri, as an attorney, you may be very interested in this. So, but I'm also a supporter of the 100 Plowshares Nonviolent Direct Actions to disarm our nuclear and conventional weapons globally, and that includes depleted uranium. So I ask you to think of the ramifications of the use of the DU munitions being shipped to Ukraine and the ramifications to all of Europe, including Russia. So at the end, please take a screenshot or a photo of the QR codes that I have, which will link you to sites with more information. And I think Janine may have, you have some links also to some of this stuff. So a footnote, I know some of you are numbers people and some are not. So I'm including numbers, so please bear with me. Can we pull up the first slide? Thank you. So, wow, I just realized it's really hard to read on my little phone. So the US is sending another $175 million in military aid to Ukraine, including many depleted uranium munitions. So these are some of the DU weapons that are being sent. Javelin and anti-tank 4 anti-armor systems, over 1 million DU ammunitions, 120 millimeter depleted uranium tank ammunitions for Abrams tanks, additional ammunition for high mobility artillery rocket systems, and more. I am not an armament expert. I'm actually, I ran a catering company for 19 years. So next slide, please. So my introduction to the issue of depleted uranium use happened in March of 2000. I went down to outside of Baltimore to the trial of Phil Berrigan, who's like an uncle, Father Steve Kelly, Liz Walsh, and Susan Crane, who is on this webinar with us today. They called themselves Plowshares versus Depleted Uranium. And they were tried for their nonviolent direct action of disarmament by hammering on an A-10 Warthog plane at the Warfield Air Force Base north of Baltimore, Maryland, a plane which fires 3,900 rounds of depleted uranium tipped munitions in 1 minute. Let me just see. So their statement read, we come to the Maryland Warfield Air National Guard Base to convert the A-10 Warthog as Roman Catholic Christians in obedience to God's prohibition against killing. Also to embody the prophet Isaiah's vision of a disarmed world where hearts are converted to compassion and justice, and the weapons are converted to the tools of peace. Finally, to atone for another nuclear war in Iraq and a third in Yugoslavia. So help us God. So just to reiterate, this was back in March of 2000 and I was with them. So next slide, please. So upon hearing, Phil Berrigan, Phil is up on the right-hand corner. Susan Crane is in the lower right-hand corner. Father Steve Kelly and Liz Walsh are there. So upon hearing Phil's opening statement of the US military leaving behind 2,000 tons of DU dust in Basra and other Iraqi cities, causing deaths of infants, horrible birth defects, and other horrific civilian health problems, my 13-year-old daughter, Anna, said, "Mom, we can't leave. I'm old enough to understand this." We were supposed to only stay for a day, but we stayed for 3 until the defendants turned their backs to the court as the truth was shut out. So the next slide, please. The A-10 Warthog plane, and I would like to point out at the very nose of this plane, you'll see the Gatling gun. You see the red little thing, but it's at the very front is where the Gatling gun is. It fires the 3,900 rounds of depleted uranium tipped munitions in 1 minute. By the way, the Gatling gun was developed right here at Ithaca Gun, and though it was tested with depleted uranium munitions in our Ithaca Falls, right near Ithaca High School. Next photo, please, or next slide. If you notice, look at these massive things. These are about twice as long as one of your tall metal coffee containers. So these things are all tipped with depleted uranium. Imagine 3,900 going in 1 minute. So the defendants were given a gag order and not permitted to explain why they disarmed the 2 warplanes. The Pentagon director of the DU program, Dr. Doug Rockey, came as an expert witness, but was not allowed to testify. No experts were allowed. So we crossed the street to a church during lunch to hear the effects of DU on both combatants, civilians, including Dr. Rockey himself, who had 6 times the allowable amount of DU in his system, but he wasn't told by the military for 2 years. Next slide, please. First, what is depleted uranium and why is it prized? DU-235 is a low-level, non-fissionable, radioactive nuclear weapon. And it's also a toxic heavy metal made from nuclear power plant spent fuel rods. Disposal is free for the nuclear power industry. They don't have to pay to bury it, usually done on indigenous lands. It's free DU for the US military contractors to create weapons, and it's prized because it's twice as dense as lead. If you look at the periodic table, you'll see uranium is right below the lead. It has the ability to pierce tanks and other military equipment like soft butter, penetrating at 4,500 degrees, the melting point of glass upon impact, and that aerosolates into fine particles as small as 1/100th to 1/1000th of a micron. So again, the numbers, I ask that you remember this. And the DU has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. Next slide, please. Environmental spread of DU dust. You can read through those. Caribbean trade winds, hurricanes, tornadoes, Middle East dust storms, and war theaters where bombing redistributes the contamination. Next slide, please. So according to Dr. Andreas Tupadakis, who was a chemist formerly of Los Alamos Laboratories, very fine DU particles are in the Earth's upper atmosphere, encircling it for years. By May of 2000, according to Dr. Doug Rockey, the US had dropped DU in 57 countries, including in the Danube River, a water source for many European cities. There is no way to contain fine DU particulates from the wind. So during the May of 2000, while I was protesting with many over 1,000 people had been to Vieques, Puerto Rico, protesting the 60 years of US Navy bombing practice, along with NATO countries. So I was walking through the bombing zone with something that was totally inadequate. I should have had a HEPA, whatever, special mask. But having just come from that trial, I realized, my God, I'm walking around in this stuff, this radioactive particulates, that every time another bomb was practiced with, those particulates were forced up into the air by 2,000 meters into the atmosphere and carried westerly over the just 11 miles over to where the people of Vieques lived, beyond the bombing zone. And then beyond by the Caribbean trade winds. And then, as we know just from last week, Hurricane Lee, 400 miles wide. Where does this stuff land? So we know that the trade winds carry Sahara desert dust across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. Super hurricanes, the famous dust storms of Iraq, Syria, and other countries' winds carry the radioactive heavy metal dust. And wherever the DU munitions are used, there will be spreading of the dust without the ability to contain it. So I studied testimony about the DU from Nobel Peace Prize winner, Dr. Helen Caldicott, in preparation to testify 7 times before the UN Special Committee on Decolonization on behalf of Puerto Rico. I was speaking as an outraged citizen of the United States, honored to be invited to speak as a part of a delegation of 40 Puerto Ricans. And I spoke of the US military's colonizers' abuse of contaminating the people and the land of Vieques with DU munitions, causing cancers and birth defects. And I should put a footnote here and just state that one of the leaders of the Vieques movement that had been arrested for decades said that the people of Vieques totally understood that their struggle to end this bombing and the use of these munitions and many other things like Agent Orange and napalm, they understood how it was intrinsically connected to all US imposition of wars in other places. So they were connecting their struggle with others. So Dr. Caldicott described how victims inhale and ingest the microscopic dust, causing it to lodge in the lining of the lungs or sequester in the large organs or the bones and the teeth. The military says it's so microscopic that it won't hurt anyone. Dr. Caldicott describes how the tiny DU particles sit within the body, emitting a radioactive pulse, changing the genetic code of cells around the particulate, causing cancers. It alters reproductive genes, changing the genetic code for every generation after, leaving a legacy of pain and suffering. Next slide, please. So DU contamination causes this list of illnesses: leukemia, nerve damage, fibromyalgia, cancer, and many other forms of illnesses, including the genetic deformities that resemble those found in victims of the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Back in the year 2005, on April 26th, it was the 50th anniversary year of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I attended a meeting close to the United Nations in New York City, and I met 5 American Iraq war vets who were suffering with many of the above mentioned ailments from high levels of DU contamination. Sergeant Gerard Matthews' baby girl was born without a hand and realized after looking at photos of Iraqi babies that many suffer with the same defect as his daughter. Neither he nor his wife had family history of birth defects. A Puerto Rican friend, Rolando Garcia, worked on the US Navy base in Vieques in 1999 for only 3 months. Rolando later tested positive for DU contamination. He still has headaches like many of the vets. He has no hair, no eyelashes, and his wife lost 2 pregnancies. One vet was quoted as saying, "Radiation is the wound that doesn't heal because you pass it on to the children and the grandchildren. That's the terror." Dr. Rosalie Bertell, who has passed, she was a whistleblower and an expert witness, testifying on behalf of Indigenous people of the Pacific Rim, a sister of the Order of the Grey Nuns from Canada, and author of the book, No Immediate Danger, Prognosis of a Radioactive Earth. According to Dr. Bertell, she says, "We are weakening the species with DU weapons." The UN's own subcommission on human rights condemned weaponry containing DU as a weapon of mass destruction against both members of the armed forces and against civilian populations. So according to Kali Rubai's September 22nd, 2020 article called "Birth Defects and the Toxic Legacy of War in Iraq," that was issued in the periodical Nature and Politics in the Mur issue. The quote, "These depleted uranium munitions are among the causes of hazards, not only to the civilians in the foreign lands where the US fights its wars, but also to American service members who took part in these conflicts. The chronic illnesses suffered by US soldiers during the 91 Gulf War in Iraq, often from exposure to DU munitions and other toxic chemicals, have already been categorized as the condition known as Gulf War syndrome. The government has been less interested in the effects of the American military's chemical footprint on Iraqis." And then she continues later in the article, quote, "Almost everyone I met in Iraq identified the high prevalence of birth defects as a post-2003 phenomenon directly related to war. Many women described having healthy children before 2003, and either many miscarriages or children with severe birth defects later. It was not uncommon for a family to line up their children by age, so I could see the visible line or witness the visible line of the before and after the US invasion. In my interview with Majid, I learned that many doctors are now advising women with a birth history of multiple birth defects to simply stop conceiving children. In a country where terminating pregnancies remains illegal and where resources for research, testing, and treatment are limited, women can face a lifetime of perpetual physical and emotional turmoil as they repeatedly carry and bear children who cannot survive. Some of the women I lived and worked with from Anbar province felt strongly that precluding the possibility of reproduction was evidence of genocidal intentions by the United States. Please note the next slide that we will be showing has very disturbing photos of Iraqi babies with deformities. So we will keep it up there for about 6 seconds. So please show the next slide. We can leave it on for another 2 seconds, 5 seconds maybe. So there's children, and we have a lot of Catholic worker friends who went into Iraq to go to the morgues and to see and take pictures to demonstrate what is going on. Thank you. So continuing the article in the quote, Dina, who experienced several miscarriages, expressed the desire to have her miscarried children counted among those who died from war. But of course, she noted sarcastically, mimicking an American man's voice, the US does not keep a body count. So further on in the article, she quotes Omar Dewachi, and he writes, the toxic legacies of militarism call us to, quote, expand our analytical perspectives to rethink what an archive of war history would include. Certainly in Iraq, an archive of war includes the bodies of children whose forms and features are irretrievably shaped by Iraq's war ecology, end quote. So today, right here and now, as we see the suffering of the Ukrainians and the Russians. Our question that we must ask ourselves is that within our political and spiritual will that we stop this illegal and immoral use of DU to happen anymore with people, with the US never-ending wars. Right now, civilians and combatants, Ukrainians and Russians and downwinder states in Europe are in the line of fire of DU contamination. Will we allow this? Only in the context of the loving communities of action can we gain courage and creativity from one another to change the world for the sake of the children. Join the week of actions, October 1st through the 8th. And as our Latin American brothers and sisters say, basta ya, enough, no more, beat swords into plowshares. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for all of your important work and for presenting that and bringing that to us today. I've posted those links in the chat so people can find out more. And I know you're involved in so much important action. So if there's anything else to post for upcoming events, we can put that in the chat also. And I think really the crux of it is we just see how dangerous these weapons are, how destructive they are for not just who they're being used against by the US military, but really for a whole world. And this is at the time when the United States just recently has announced the plan to send these depleted uranium munitions and weapons to Ukraine. Another important reason for calling for an end to NATO fueling this war and for Canada out of NATO. So I will pass it over to Brendan to introduce our next speaker, and thank you again, Marianne.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. There's so much more to be said, but it's just, if I may just say this, it was so shocking once again to go on to the media of today where they're saying, well, it's disputed. You know, it's like, give me a break. Anyway.
Well, thanks again, Marianne and Janine. And yes, I'm glad people are mentioning the October 1 to 8 days of action. So hopefully we'll see you in your communities. We'll see everyone out. Again, there's going to be regional events all over. So it's my understanding our final speaker before we open question period is Glenn Michalchuk. And it's my understanding he provided a relatively short bio, but Glenn Michalchuk is the national president of the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, as has been mentioned, and he is also the chair of Peace Alliance Winnipeg. So thanks. Let's go over to Glenn.
Thank you very much. And I have to say it's very heartening to see the number of participants on this webinar. And it just reaffirms with me that the importance that civil society has played in opposing this war, as with other wars, and that our actions as civil society are extremely important. And unfortunately, our politicians, at least in countries such as Canada, are sadly out of step with what Canadians and others see as the dangers. So to begin, I want to emphasize the importance of the coming International Week of Actions to end the war in Ukraine. In the Western Bloc countries that comprise NATO, support for the war has been almost universal amongst the governments and in the media. It has been accomplished through the silencing of dissent by labeling anyone who is urging negotiations, ceasefire, and peace as a propaganda instrument of Russia. The only voices for reason and sanity have come from civil society, and on both the left and right of the political spectrum. The decision by the United States to supply cluster munitions is the latest action to escalate this war, and also escalates the effects of this war on the people of Ukraine. These munitions will remain a danger for decades and generations to come. In a coming time of peace and reconstruction, they will surface in deadly ways as a reminder of this war. Their use will make reconstruction more costly and difficult. The provision of cluster munitions also shows how desperate the situation for NATO has become as it pursues this war. Like the carpet bombing of Vietnam and the use of Agent Orange to defoliate the jungles, it is indicative of a war that knows no legal constraints to attain its aims. Repeatedly, in the escalation of this war, we have seen that the ends justify the means. In this case, the stated intention of the US and NATO, and I would add Canada, is the destruction of Russia. With such logic, we cannot rule out more deadly escalations with more deadly weapons, either chemical, biological, or nuclear. The provisions of cluster munitions indicates that the great gulf that exists between the purposes of the Zelensky government and that of the people of Ukraine. It is they who have been forced to bear the consequences of Zelensky's failure to avert war in February of 2022. And when war did break out, a failure to take advantage of possibilities to end that war through a peace agreement signed in April 2022. How did we get to this point? How did we get to the point that Ukraine has been turned into a killing ground, with millions having fled the country and unlikely to ever return, its economy shredded by war, and its environment devastated with depleted uranium and cluster bombs? The West, and now I want to focus on the Canadian government, members of the Canadian Parliament who form the opposition, and the large corporate media, have been tone deaf to the issue of peace in Ukraine. The impetus for this war emerges out of the relentless NATO expansion that escalated security tensions with Russia. Politically, support for this war is garnered through a section of the Ukrainian Canadian diaspora. For political and ideological reasons rooted in national and social chauvinism, they favored war with Russia. They can be considered part of the ideological bulwark that drove the confrontation and escalation which led to this war. The prolongation of this war has been through the silencing of dissent and any opposition to it. There is no Canadian member of Parliament who is willing to speak out against the war, or more particularly the provisions of cluster munitions. The lack of response to cluster munitions is ironic, considering Canada spearheaded the creation of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines, known as the Ottawa Treaty, in 1991. More than 130 countries signed this treaty, including Ukraine. In September 2016, Canada became a state party on the Convention on the Cluster Munitions. And has been pointed out, Ukraine did not sign this treaty. One of Canada's duties as signatory is to ensure implementation of the treaty. And one of the relevant clauses in regards to this is, and I quote, assist, encourage, or induce anyone to engage in activity prohibited to a state party under this convention, end quote.
Oh,
Glenn,
it looks like you hit mute there, Glenn. There we
Yes,
go.
and I don't know where I broke off, so I'll just reread a short sentence. Signatories to the treaty are obliged to discourage the use of cluster munitions up to and, quote, including the imposition of penal sanctions to prevent and suppress any activity prohibited, end quote, under the convention. Through its provision of howitzers and other weapons and its furtherance of the war, Canada is in violation of its obligations to the treaty. It is tragic to say that the provision of cluster munitions for widespread use has met with only the most perfunctory of responses in the West. Despite the international outcry and the clear violation of international treaties, the Canadian government made only the mildest objections to the US decision to supply cluster munitions to Ukraine. In the same statement, Canada specifically ruled out any change in its support for the war. Canadian officials also refused to give an opinion if the provision of cluster munitions constituted a war crime. Now the Canadian government will host Zelensky, the man who requested these weapons, to speak to parliamentarians on Friday. Lloyd Axworthy, who was a key negotiator of the Ottawa Treaty, was one of the few, and I would think perhaps the only politician to issue more than a tepid response to the transfer of cluster munitions to Ukraine. He said, I quote, "There's an old saying that once you unleash the dogs of war, you're never sure where they're going to run. Well, I think we've unleashed this whole issue using these terrible weapons. This is going to be a legacy that Ukraine will have for years and years, where its own people will be under risk," end quote. In conclusion, I just want to reiterate the stance of the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians. We said this war could be averted, and when it was not, the issue of ending it became the urgent necessity. We opposed the escalation of this war precisely because it was avoidable. It was clear other forces were driving the confrontation with Russia for their own ends, and were using Ukraine and its people as the means to do this. The consequences to Ukraine have become enormous. It is unclear what peace may look like, but one thing is certain: more war will only exacerbate the destruction of Ukraine. The urgent necessity is to end this war. If you support Ukraine, you will end this war. Thank you.
And thank you, Glenn. That was wonderful. And as was the case with the other panelists, I think it will give people a lot to discuss and think about. Just looking at our run of show plans here, and it looks like, yes, what's coming next is our Q&A period. And it looks like we're almost on schedule. So that's rare. But anyway, yes, we're almost on time. And we're going to be taking these questions predominantly from the question and answer box, the Q&A box that exists here in Zoom. Some other people will go through the chat to see if there's certain questions they can find. They'll probably put them in the Q&A box also, so that they're easier for us, the panelists and hosts, to find. It's come to our attention that there's a number of questions that are similar in nature. There's questions about the way forward, essentially, in terms of where to go from here. And there were about 4 questions on the basis of seeking peace in Ukraine. So I'm going to read one of them by Kamal K. And Kamal was asking, "Thanks, Dmitry, for your extensive report on Ukraine issue. What do you think a reasonable peace plan would comprise for both parties to be acceptable, knowing that Russia won't be handing over the captured provinces in addition to Crimea, and Ukraine wants them back? Is any of the proposed peace plans by South Africa, China, and others a realistic plan?" And I think that was addressed to Dmitry, so we'll probably let him go first on that. And if the other panelists want to answer, they can too. I think Dmitry was muted, so we may have to unmute him.
Thank you. You can hear me, Brendan? Great. And thank you for the question. This is such an important question. I want to preface my answer by saying that when it comes to the terms of any peace deal, I myself am completely agnostic. All that I care about is that the war stop and that the peace resulting from the negotiation be a durable one, that it not break down, and that there be a resumption of hostilities and a resumption of the killing. So whatever the parties, whatever common ground that the parties can find that is durable, I would support. Now, having said that, and having paid close attention to both sides to this conflict, I think there are certain realities that those of us who want this war to end are going to have to deal with. And above all, the Ukrainian government is going to have to deal with these realities. The first reality is that Russia ain't giving back these territories, especially Crimea. I think that Russia may be open to modest adjustments in the line of contact. So maybe give up a little bit of land here, take a little bit of land there. I think that Russia may be open to giving up its claim to those portions of the annexed oblast that it does not control. So for example, it does not control all of Kherson region. It annexed it, but it only controls about 60% of it. It doesn't control all of Zaporozhye. It doesn't even control all of Donetsk and Luhansk. So it may be willing to give up what it doesn't currently control, even though legally, under Russian law, they've annexed it. But the idea that Russia's just going to walk away from these territories now, I think is a complete pipe dream. And anybody who insists that it do that, particularly as a precondition to having any negotiations at all, is dooming Ukraine to destruction. The second thing, and I think the thing that's even less negotiable from the perspective of the Russians, and frankly, there's no reason why they should negotiate on this point, is Ukraine's membership in NATO. Ukraine should be a neutral country. There was absolutely no problem for Austria remaining a neutral country, Sweden remaining a neutral country, Finland remaining a neutral country. They managed to do Switzerland, of course. They managed to do these for decades without being attacked or subjugated by Russia. And in fact, they had very pro-Western policies, and economically and politically were highly integrated with Western countries. There's no reason why that can't happen with respect to Ukraine, and that should have been the course that should have been pursued. Things get, I think that's absolutely clear that that's all that the Russians would accept on those two fronts. And there's really no way to prevent them, practically speaking, from getting their way. Ultimately, they will retain these territories, essentially what they currently hold. Now, there are two questions that remain, at least two, in a broad sense, and that is, what do you do about this whole question of, as the Russians term it, denazification? I don't know exactly what they have in mind in that regard. I think they've been very obscure about indicating what that might satisfy them. I think a good place to start is just to abolish this national holiday that Ukraine's parliament declared in favor of Stepan Bandera. That was something that was inexcusable, and I don't know why anybody in the West would object to, the abolition of that national holiday. He was a Nazi collaborator, and he was complicit in the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent civilians, Poles, Russians, and Jews. So beyond that, I don't know what more the Russian government might expect, but that's something you'll only find out by having a negotiation. And then, of course, something that's absolutely critically important, the fourth point of the four things that I think, broadly speaking, must be discussed is the reconstruction of Ukraine. This is going to be an extraordinary challenge, which is going to require massive amounts of investment. And I certainly think that Russia should contribute an enormous amount of money to that enterprise, but so too should the West, because it bears a great deal of responsibility for the suffering of the Ukrainian people. And all hands on deck in that regard. And I also happen to believe that the Chinese government would probably be willing to contribute quite significantly to the reconstruction of Ukraine if there's a durable peace deal in place. So again, I'm just predicting what a peace deal would look like. The question at the end of the day is, are Western countries, who are ultimately, I think, determining the course that the Ukrainian government will follow. I don't think Ukraine is a sovereign state anymore. It's completely dependent upon Western support, and I don't think that the United States government and its allies give this kind of money without any strings being attached. If there's going to be a peace deal, they're going to have to accept that compromises must be made. And the question is, are they ready yet? I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, well, thank you, Dmitry, for that comprehensive answer. I've been informed that one of the related questions on this topic is from Yuri, and he addressed a question specifically to Glenn. And his question is, Yuri says, my friend Boyan believes that Ukraine will cease to be a country it once was, and will see it partitioned with Western Ukraine, with Kiev as its capital, that's allied with the collective West, and Eastern Ukraine will become separate countries, or like Crimea, they'll become part of Russia if a referendum is held. And while the West will never recognize Eastern Ukraine being its own country or part of Russia, much of the rest of the world will recognize this nation. I'm curious as to your response. So that was for Glenn.
That's an interesting question, and I think there's a lot of truth to what it may be trying to get at in terms of the future of Ukraine. I think the first thing to recognize is that this war, organized by the West and organized by that very reactionary section of the Ukrainian diaspora, has brought Ukraine to this point where it has been torn apart. In fact, within the first few weeks when the war broke out, I wrote something for Peace Alliance Winnipeg, because I'm also chair of Peace Alliance Winnipeg, that we never published, but pointed out that this was probably the course that Ukraine was headed to, that it would be partitioned in various ways. We should remember also that part of Western Ukraine was ceded to Ukraine from Poland after the Second World War. And there's parts of Hungary and Romania that were also, and I think Czechoslovakia, that were also ceded to Ukraine after the Second World War. And before the war broke out, there was, of course, the Minsk agreements, which talked about a resolution of this division within Ukraine. Ukraine was a divided country before the war. It was divided between East and West in terms of the politics of the people, in terms of their various gravitations, and so on. Before the war broke out, there was the question of solving the problem of the war in the Donbass, which was a reflection of these divisions, a reflection of what had happened in Kiev in 2014 and the seizure of power there by a very pro and U.S. government. And that was the Minsk agreements. And that too was lost by starting this war. So the idea of a partition between Ukraine is actually something that Ukraine people have been discussing as this war has prolonged. In fact, at our we had a meeting of our national committee of the AUUC a few weeks ago. And this was actually something that came out of a discussion of one of our branches, which has, a membership of recent Ukrainian immigrants to Canada, and presented this as a possible solution. And I think it is something seriously that the people of Ukraine might even be looking at. So it's not. I think it recognizes some of the realities of what's happened in this war.
Thank you, Glenn. Oh.
I was just going to say that's a great answer, Glenn, and very thoroughly comprehensive. I think, Janine has been preparing some questions. There's a group of related questions about the anti-war movement. And then there was other questions about DU. Janine, which do you think we should go first on?
Maybe actually let's go with the ones on DU first, because I think the ones on the anti-war movement are a great place probably for us to start wrapping up. We do have quite a few questions, and we are trying to group as many as possible together so that we can try and get to as many questions as possible. I do apologize if we do not get to everyone's question. And Brendan, before we do go on to more questions, I did just again want to announce we're coming up to the Global Week of Action to end the war on Ukraine, being organized all around the world and here in Canada, coordinated with the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. It's October 1st to 8th, demanding peace now, stop the war, stop NATO, but also demanding fund peace, not war, negotiations, not escalation, yes to climate justice and peace, no to NATO, water bombers, not fighter jets, and Canada out of NATO. I'll post the link in the chat where you can find out about upcoming events. But also, I know there are a lot of people from the different groups who are organizing events. So if you can put your local event info in the chat, that will help get people connected. So Brendan, do you want to read the questions about directed towards Marianne?
Sure, of course. And yes, information about the Global Week of Action is just being posted in the chat right now for the overall link to that and the Peace and Justice Network. So yeah, when we handed out flyers for this event today, it also contained information that there is this coming up on October 1st to 8th. We really wanted to raise awareness of that and build up to that. So yes, although there's a variety of other questions coming up, there's one that's directed specifically at Mary Ann. And this is from Vanessa. And she says, thank you to our speakers. I have a question for Mary Ann. I sincerely hope this is not the case, but I wanted to get your opinion. If sizable amounts of DU are used in Ukraine, do you think because of the location of Ukraine and it being a breadbasket of Europe and grain being impossible to protect from DU particulate in the wind, what similar side effects will be seen in Ukraine as in Iraq? What kind of impact will this have on the anti-DU movement? Obviously, we do not want it to be used as all, but I'm wondering about your thoughts on this conflict being in Eastern Europe and the fact that Ukraine is largely white and easier accessed by researchers and tech infrastructures. How can the peace and anti-DU movement support Ukrainians facing the toxic ecology of war and to end its use forever?
So thank you for the question, Vanessa. I'm curious as to where she's from, where Vanessa's from. You know, that's a hard one to unpack. What I recommend is that people look at maps. You look at where Ukraine is situated and just understand and look at the weather patterns and look at where the winds blow. And my understanding is that there was an accident, and your father, Ken, pointed that out to me. I have to admit, I've not been following enough of all the details of the Ukraine war. I'm so grateful for Dimitri and for Glenn and the others who know way more than I do. Generally, I feel that the DU manufacturers and the weapons makers are making a killing. As they say, war is great for business, you know. And I think it's really important if we, in the United States and in Canada, look at our weapons makers and see who they are and what kind of profit they're coming out with. All of what I described in my presentation was old stuff. But the fact is that what depleted uranium does is not going to change. So yes, the birth defects are going to happen. The genetic deformities may happen. You have the toxic heavy metals illnesses that will be affecting people. You know, people's immune systems will be weakened. It's a bloody mess, and I don't have any one straight answer. I know that there are scientists in Puerto Rico who have been trying to take soil samples, and I'm sorry that I can't pull up the name, and I'd have to look in my text. Maybe after, when somebody else is answering another question, I'll pull up the name of a particular scientist who has been doggedly documenting all of the contamination by the US Navy in Vieques to determine what it is that the direct correlation of illnesses and others. I'll try to find that and put it in the chat. I'm sorry, I don't have more direct information than that. One of the problems that the vets found in the United States, more so than, let's say, European countries that were in the theater in Iraq, is that our government never took responsibility, just like the Vietnam vets with Agent Orange and napalm. The US has wiped its hands of victims of these terrible toxic chemicals. But in Europe, there were countries that did take responsibility and gave reparations to their soldiers. So that's an important thing to look at. Anyway, I know the testing for DU contamination had to go outside of the country because any university that wanted to, let's say, study and test for DU contamination would have its funding withdrawn. The military provides a lot of funding for a lot of the universities in the United States. So I know, for example, there was a centrifuge machine that was sent to, and I only remember this because Robin Hood was one of my favorite stories as a kid. There was a scientist, a geologist in Nottingham, England, who actually did the testing of DU by putting teeth into this centrifuge and then coming out with the exact amount of the DU within it. But it's hard to come by. That's the bottom line, at least within the US.
Thanks, Mary Ann. I understand we'll be coming up shortly to a group of questions about the anti-war movement. Before I do that, there was a specific question directed at you, Mary Ann, so I thought we should take care of it now, perhaps. That is, the question is, would you care to comment on the recent IAEA report that DU weapons don't pose a health hazard to civilians or combatants?
Yes, if I may read a response to that, and I would like people to think about what it is that I presented already. So there was a report to the General Assembly of the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. In studies in which the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, was involved, the resulting radiological risk to the public and the environment was not significant in situations where depleted uranium is observed in the form of localized contamination of the environment by small particulates resulting from the impacts. However, in the situation where fragments of or complete depleted uranium ammunitions were found, there is a potential risk of radiation effects for individuals who come in direct contact with such fragments or ammunitions. This risk can be mitigated by the national authorities through conducting such simple countermeasures as the collection, the storage, and the disposal of such fragments. Nevertheless, in a post-conflict environment, the presence of depleted uranium residues can further increase the anxiety of local populations. I mean, imagine this. The results of the radiological assessments conducted by the IAEA in cooperation with UNEP and the WHO provide the basis for public reassurance. I'm so shocked at that kind of response. It's such, yeah, Dr. Rocky, God rest his soul, he just passed away from COVID in the last year and a half. He was teaching out at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And I mean, being sick, he was training US troops to go to Iraq, knowing how to protect themselves with the protective gear. And when he got out there and he was wearing the hazmat suit and the particular mask and everything, his guys who were out in the tanks and stuff were saying, "Boss, what are you doing?" He said, "This stuff is radioactive." And as I read in my report, you know, people were experiencing bloody urine and other ailments that they couldn't explain afterwards. Doug said that the equipment that they were given was totally inadequate. And what did the Army say? Just use duct tape to fix it up, you know. Unacceptable. And as Dr. Helen Caldecott said, and Dr. Tupadakis said, as Dr. Tom Fazy, the epidemiologist from Mount Sinai Hospital, who also worked with the vets, they all pointed out the fact that this stuff becomes minute. And that's the nature of the explosion. When the armament has impact, it explodes and aerosolates. That's why they love it, because it can penetrate metal like butter. So there's no way to contain that.
Well,
Does that answer the?
I think it probably does quite thoroughly. So thank you. And I think Vanessa posted in the chat a response to your response. So thanking you. So you can look for that in the chat.
Okay.
And
you.
so we're gonna briefly extend the event, as is often the case. We're gonna extend by 15 minutes. I understand we were scheduled to end at this time at 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. But because there's so many questions and we still can't handle them all, but we're going to try to get some more of these questions in. And I think Janine has lumped some questions together concerning the anti-war movement. So yeah, I'm going to let Janine present these questions to our panelists.
Great, thank you, Brendan. And before I do, we've just posted in the chat all of the events currently, and there are more being planned, but currently planned across Canada for the Week of Action, October 1st to 8th. So make sure to check if there's a city near you that you can join an action for. So I think an important question or group of questions as we wrap up our webinar tonight is really on what's next. What can we do to end this war, to end NATO fueling this war, and what's our role as peace-loving people, as anti-war activists to combat this? So I'll read through questions, kind of asking the same question from a few different directions. So there are some questions on how do we, as part of civil society, change the dominant narrative about the war on Ukraine, and how do we build a large peace movement again? And how do we respond to the argument that we have to send weapons for defense of Ukraine? I think that's a big one, is how do we, as anti-war activists or people who are wanting to talk about this, bring those important points and arguments. There's also a question for Glenn if the AUUC will be doing a media release about Zelensky's visit and Canada's role in Ukraine, and also questions about the danger of nuclear war and the environmental danger of this war, which I think especially the depleted uranium was a big point about that. And then feeding into that question is, how do we get environmental groups to ally with us? And then lastly, a question about, this is a bit of a longer question, so I'll read it out here. Approving cluster munitions to the Ukrainian armed forces appears to be part of a concerted dehumanization campaign against Russians and Belarusians, with an outdated, partially generational Cold War echo. I've heard Canadians otherwise against racism say they're not human about Russians. How can people in the West stop or reduce the dehumanization of Russian people, both abroad and in Canada, when the current Western media empire vilifies Russian and Russians with Russophobia? So I'll hand that over to our speakers, and this will be also your wrap up before we close the webinar today. Maybe Dimitri, would you like to go first?
Yeah, by the way, I don't know whether my camera's working. I had something happen to my phone as I was.
We can see you.
Yes,
You
you're
can see
good.
me, okay, great. Okay, so I'll tackle a lot of questions in there. So I'm going to focus on what you can do and the question about Russophobia. In terms of what you can, this is one of these crises where I'm going to put it this way, where the truth will do all the hard work for you. I think that if people, and this is what I mean by that, is that if people understand what is actually going on and what the objectives of this war are, and where this is all heading in a military sense and an economic sense, I think the vast majority of human beings in Western society would not put up with this for one moment. The only reason why the elites have gotten away with this is because of the extraordinary, unprecedented propaganda campaign surrounding this war. And those of us who have been fighting to be heard since this invasion began, our task has been made a great deal easier in the last few months by the fact that reality has caught up with the propaganda narrative to a considerable degree. And you're seeing a lot of reports in the mainstream media, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Times of London, for example. Not necessarily in the Canadian media, which always seems to get the truth last in the Western world for some reason. But in other major respected mainstream media organizations, a lot of the truth is coming out. Certainly the love affair with Volodymyr Zelensky is over. And I think that really what you can do, and it's a great contribution that you can make, is people you know, people who respect you, people who are willing to engage with you in dialogue about difficult subjects, talk to them about the realities of this war. Take the risk that they're going to, you're some kind of a Russian propagandist. That's a risk that we have to take if we're going to spread the truth about this war. And in that regard, your task is made easier because you can find reports within the mainstream media today, recent reports, which are conveying the truth about this war to a degree that is unprecedented during the time since the invasion began. And so find those articles, find those reports. Even human rights organizations are starting to, focus more in a more balanced way about what's going on in the battlefield. And share them with your friends, share them with your colleagues. And once they are informed about what is going on, they will then apply the pressure to their elected representatives. And of course, to the extent that you can do that, you should do it. You should reach out to your MP. You should call people up in the political party that you're a member of, people who are involved in policy making, send emails, get them to sign petitions, submit petitions to them. Let them know that you are not on board with this depraved proxy war. And as I say, we're at an inflection point. I think there was never a better time to, take up the challenge than now. In terms of Russophobia, all I can say about that, and this is regrettably, this is really a phenomenon that is the product of decades of indoctrination in the West. I remember when I was a kid growing up during the Cold War, how Russians and the Soviet peoples more broadly were constantly being demonized in the popular media and in the news. And then there was a period of about 10 years when Yeltsin was in power, where the propaganda died down to a considerable degree. It was, less intense and scandalous than it had been at a point in my lifetime. But that's only because Boris Yeltsin was effectively a drunken buffoon who was doing the bidding of Western governments. And as soon as his era ended, the demonization began again. So you're dealing with a phenomenon that has been in the works that's the product of many, many years of indoctrination. And I think that really just humanize the Russian people. Talk about your personal interactions with Russians. Remind your fellow citizens about the many ways in which Russian culture and Russian science has contributed to the betterment of humankind, and point out to them that most of the world is not on board with the sanctions and the attempt to isolate Russia. That's really only a program that seems to enjoy some degree of popular support in the West. But outside the West, it seems that the majority view is that people want Russia to be very much, and Russia's culture, its economy, its scientific achievements, all to be integrated into the global economy and global society. But that's a big challenge, as I say, because of the many, many years of indoctrination that we've been subjected to here in the West.
Thank you, Dimitri. Marianne or Glenn, do either of you also want to respond?
Glenn, do you want to go?
Sure. First of all, everything that Dimitri said is right on. You have to continue to fight. You have to continue to fight against all the propaganda that's going on. I mean, his tour, absent the deplatforming events, like his tour was, his speaking engagement in Winnipeg was deplatformed twice, and we've still found a venue. And we had about 70 plus people come there. It goes to show that if that people, and these are people who are not just close supporters of the Peace Alliance Winnipeg, these were all kinds of people. It does show that there's a real interest out there amongst people to hear the truth. And I think absent those deplatforming efforts, we would have had easily 170 people. And I think most venues, most cities would have had easily 100 plus people to come in here to make them speak. So it's important to do this. I do think it is important for people to go after their politicians and speak to them. The Edmonton Peace Council went, along with our president of our AAUC branch in Edmonton, went to speak to Heather McPherson, the NDP critic for foreign affairs. Sure, they did not get a lot of response from her, but I think it's important to go to speak to your MPs, because not all of these MPs are of the same vein or committed. I remember reading the Hansard during the Take Note debate in January 2022, or parts of the Hansard. And there were MPs saying, I've been bombarded nonstop by the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Why I have to support escalation against Russia. This is January 2022. And there were some MPs who said, I'd like to hear more about this. I'd like to hear more about what the issues are. And I think there are those MPs out there. There are politicians who have spoken out against the war. The leader of the Green Party in Quebec, very early on, took a very principled stand against the war. So it is important to speak to these politicians, to encourage them. I myself, there was an article in the Toronto Star, not the Toronto Star, the main Toronto newspaper. I'm sorry, the main, not the Globe and Mail, but the other one. Just escapes me for the moment. Anyhow, it was on Zelensky's visit to Canada. So I wrote a comment in the online edition, and I was surprised that there were 3 or 4 people who wrote back, and I think all of them were in support of the comment, as well as there are many other comments like mine, which were critical of what Zelensky was coming here to do, which was basically just ask for more money and more war, and Canadians should not support that. Lastly, I'll just point out on this question of Russophobia, it's correct. I mean, Canadians are conditioned by 70 years of Cold War ideology on the question of Russia, but Canadians also think about these things. I remember in January 2022, as the tensions were rising in Ukraine, on the Ukraine border, the Russians were massing troops and so on. The Peace Alliance Winnipeg looked at the situation and said we should begin demonstrating against the possibility of what was going to happen of war. And we decided that we would go with a banner that said, no war with Russia. I was sort of wondering what the response would be given this 70 years of Cold War hysteria about Russia. And to my surprise, the response was positive. People were very positive that someone was saying no war with Russia. So I think there's a lot of room here for Canadians to just keep pushing on this issue individually, because certainly the media is not doing it for us and others. And to write letters to the editors, because they do get in all these things. I was fortunate to be able to, with the help of some activists in Southern Ontario, get an op-ed into the Metroland newspapers back after speaking to the city council in Kingston. I think Kingston it was, or St. Catharines, and on a question of the non-support for the war in Ukraine. And it got published, and we received a lot of feedback on it at the national office here. So there is opportunities. And yes, I think the AUUC will at least send to MPs our basic message about peace in Ukraine in preparation for Zelensky's visit, because we discussed that at length, as I said a few weeks ago. Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
Sorry.
Sorry, Marianne, just before I pass it over to you, I wanted to quickly say there has been a few requests for links for more information specifically about Canadian tax information that can be introduced to Canadian taxpayers regarding Ukraine using cluster bombs against civilians, and any links that could be posted about the use of cluster bombs. And also, if there are links that people have posted earlier in the chat to other important information and news, please repost them so that everyone can make sure to keep them for reference. You should be able to save the chat, but I know it's easier if we just have all the links kind of all in one place, and you don't have to search for it. So Marianne, I will hand it back over to you to wrap us up before we close out the webinar for tonight.
Thank you. I so appreciate Dimitri and Glenn's pitching the next part to me. So I pulled up a Global Times Investigates article. It says, how much has the US Big Five weapons manufacturers gained from arms sales in Ukraine? I think it's really critical to follow the money and just to understand that the weapons manufacturers, as the article says, you know, big business or war is good for business. A recruiter for BlackRock told the O'Keefe Media Group in June, acknowledging how such turmoil can create opportunities for profit. So it's one of the largest asset management companies and holds shares in several defense industry enterprises. So to speaking to this issue of the weapons makers driving the war, there is a Merchants of Death tribunal that's coming up. And the way it's been, how can I say, described is through videos. We're going to roll out the first video on November 12th. And then every Sunday evening following that, there'll be half-hour videos. And the videos are going to show how, since World War I, how the US weapons makers, through the leaders in government and all, have manufactured consent along with the corporate media. And how during World War I, that whole issue, the United States populace did not want to participate in war. And yet it was almost like overnight that it happened. And who made the profit back then? So this tribunal builds on the history and how it is that we are at this point. And what I wanted to point out, which I think is just absolutely critical, and we've not spoken about it, but the nuclear buildup on the borders and with nuclear weapons facing Russia, we're in really bad shape. My sister Ellen and a bunch of Catholic workers from the United States went to Volkel Air Force Base in the Netherlands, and then they went to Bukel, which is in Germany. Those two bases, the folks took Article 1 and Article 2 of the Treaty for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which is an earlier treaty that it's not the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but they took huge copies of this and they glued it onto the tarmac of these Air Force bases. And the reason they did this is because what's going on, the US imposing nuclear weapons on non-nuclear states is illegal. And then, you know, Ellen was being arrested and the officer was like, well, why'd you do this? You know, and Ellen said, I'm here to uphold international law. I'm not here to break law. And I think that's one of the things that we all need to think about when we go and, let's say, do protests or whatever. We're here to uphold humanitarian law. We're here to uphold a higher law, which protects life. So Glenn, you brought up the issue of being out in the streets and getting a feel for people. And also the issue of Russophobia. We also have had a presence for the last 20 years against war, against nuclear weapons, against drone strikes, against depleted uranium, out on the busiest corner in all of Little Ithaca. We have 39,000 cars that pass in the day. So every Saturday morning, we have a group of us that go out and we've got big banners. We talk about the Merchants of Death. And by the way, Cornell West, John Pilger, and a whole slew of really important people will be jurists for this tribunal. So it's going to take time to roll it out, but there will be a decision about what the United States and our, I say our weapons makers, since the top 5 are here on this territory. You know, we've got to pull back. The bottom line is we heard Lloyd Austin on the tarmac at Ramstein Air Force Base saying, our purpose is to weaken Russia. And then we heard Biden say, and forgive me, I don't remember the dates. He said, we want regime change in Russia. We've got to look back at the Pentagon white papers from 2000, Vision 2020, when they're talking about having, the US was talking about having total global domination. And we have 800 bases around the world. You talk about bringing in environmentalists on this issue of militarism and pulling back from war. If you just think of the example of Jeff Bezos going up for his 10-minute joyride. Do you have any idea of how much carbon emissions that one little rocket ship ride took? It was 570,000 cars driving for one year. So transpose that little figure of one rocket going up to all the rockets it takes to conduct war, and that's how the US runs war, is through its satellites. We got to get the satellites up there. How do we get all of the armaments, the forces, everybody to 800 bases, and then to arm all these NATO nations? We're in a thick mess, and war is driving the climate crisis, is my understanding. The US military promotes more greenhouse gases than 145 countries combined. So that's just one more reason to say no to war. It doesn't work, it's obsolete. Let's get on board. So as people pass, the sense that we've gotten from people, the drivers that go by, we've gotten at least 75 to 80% of the people are giving us thumbs up or honking, which is so encouraging. It is a sea change, and that's in the midst of this. And we were out on that corner when things were boiling, and a couple of years ago when this first started. Anyway, I'm going to end there. Thank you. Thank you for each of you.
Thank you, Marianne. And I think Brendan has a few words before we wrap up here.
Yes, thank you to Mary and all of our distinguished panelists today. This was a great event. It was a great webinar, great questions. People were very engaged. I'm glad we were able to get to a majority of the questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them today. And I'm glad that a lot of them were about activism and what can be done, because we're at the stage where we need to have mobilization in order to change policy. And I think people understand that. And there were some questions in the chat about getting the links that were posted in the chat. And it's come to my attention that Zoom is only allowing the webinar hosts to save the chat right now. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to save the chat, get the links from that chat that were posted, and we'll make them available. I understand Janine is going to email some people the links that are from the chat, but also in Hamilton, we will post the chat links on the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War website at hcsw.ca. So in about 24 hours, we'll have the links in question freely available on the front page of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War website at hcsw.ca for everyone. And of course, video of this event is being recorded right now. And of course, that will be made available at a later time as well. So thanks everyone for coming. And I'm going to let Janine close out.
Thank you, Brendan. I just, on the links, yes, I think that's great that they'll be on the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War website. So everyone can check those out in about 24 hours. And I want to again thank our speakers, Dimitri, Marianne and Glenn. We had so much information and so much that we can now use as we go out onto the streets, as we talk to people about ending NATO, about Canada out of NATO, about ending the war by stopping NATO and pushing for negotiations instead. So again, the links were just posted, or information was just posted in the chat for the upcoming events for the Global Week of Action to End the War on Ukraine, October 1st to 8th. Please join if you can. I'm just doing one last post there. Make sure you go to peaceandjusticenetwork.ca and see the work that the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network is doing. Keep up to date. If you're part of an organization that's not part of the network, I encourage you to join us. And let's get out onto the streets for this week of action and end the war. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Take care. Thank you.